Thanks, Tori. I'll take care of advancing the slides. And thanks for the introduction. Going to share with you some work that I conducted along with my colleague Beth Mattingly at the Carsey School. And basically, we wanted to know what states have planned, in terms of the policies that they've laid out to help rural schools get more of their share of really great teachers and keep those great teachers. So to start things off, we just have a poll question to get you kind of thinking back to when, you were in school. What was your experience with teachers? What adjective of these four would you say best describes the teachers that you had? Were they clueless or engaging, or would you say they're unqualified or knowledgeable? Just to get you thinking about the variability in teachers that might be out there. All right. Let's take a look at what people are saying. It's like knowledgeable is up there, and then engaging, and just a few had more of the clueless teachers in their school. Nobody unqualified. So much like the HQT requirement where no one's unqualified. So that's funny. So this was just to get you thinking about, what is it like to have a great teacher at school compared to not having such a great teacher. And basically, one thing we know is that just like any profession, there are great teachers and less than great teachers. And something else we know is that the great teachers, if you're a poor or minority student, you're less likely to have one of those in front of you. And this really spurred what are called teacher equity plans, which the call for them was made about 2 years ago by Secretary Duncan, requiring each state to take a look at their data and make sure that poor and minority children in their state aren't taught by either inexperienced, unqualified, or out-of-field teachers at higher rates than other students in their state. And there are a few components to these plans. The first thing that states had to do is analyze their teacher equity gaps. So basically, some proxy for teacher excellence. Is there a gap between, poor and affluent schools? Is there a gap between racially diverse schools versus, racially homogeneous schools, for instance? And if a state were to identify a gap, they had to propose a strategy to close that gap. And states had to look at these three statutory metrics, rates of inexperienced or unqualified or out-of-field teachers. But they could go beyond that, and many states did, to look at, say, observational data from teacher evaluation systems or teacher turnover trends, etc. And although it was required to look at, accessing gaps in access along lines of poverty and racial composition, doing so across urbanicity or rurality, basically across some sort of place metric, wasn't required. But we know that from the research that rural teachers are less likely to hold a master's degree or to have attended selective college. They're more likely to be a novice, to be teaching out of field. And more than that, we know that if you were to propose a strategy to try to help staffing solutions in a rural school, rural schools have unique context. By definition, they're more remote and less, in a less dense area, and they're all more likely to be small and poor. So, we really wanted to know what is being done out there with states in terms of whether or not they looked at their data around rural teachers and whether or not they proposed some staffing solutions. And the first step in doing that was going out into the research and seeing what was being done by other states prior to this call for teacher equity plans. And what we did was we kind of organized all these strategies that we found, these rural specific strategies, into 4 different buckets: grow your own, financial incentives, communities of practice, and capacity building. And so Real quick, I'll just run through what I mean by these. We're going to hear from other presenters as they go into the nitty-gritty and on-the-ground experiences with some of these. So grow your own programs are really, as the name suggests, trying to develop existing talent pools. And the idea is that if you grow up in a rural area, you have positive experiences, you're more likely to want to stay there. And they can really target anywhere along the continuum, from current high school students, introducing education careers to them, or working with IHEs to create rural-specific programs, say rural student teaching placements, for instance. Or trying to retrain at the professional level, trying to turn, say, service-oriented professionals like ex-military into classroom teachers, or creating pipelines to allow paraprofessionals to upskill to be classroom teachers. Financial incentives are also something used in rural schools, and clearly financial incentives aren't limited to rural schools, but rural teachers make a lot less, and they also move to higher paying schools outside of rural areas more often than the inverse. So there's reason to believe that financial incentives might be particularly attractive in rural areas. In reviewing the literature, you see lots of different ways that incentives can take place, be it signing retention bonuses, trying to create something more in-kind like housing stipends or providing housing stock in areas where it's typically short, or loan forgiveness is another possibility for financial incentives. Rural communities of practice are trying to develop in-service teachers and better prepare and retain teachers that are already in rural settings. Again, why the rural context? Because when you're dealing with small and isolated communities, you have different constraints in trying to develop teachers. So, for instance, rural teachers have voiced concerns about not having subject and grade level peers. And so rural communities of practice try to kind of bridge this gap through either mentoring and induction programs that are really situated in the community, or utilizing distance learning technologies, and really just trying to bring rural schools together. And finally, capacity building is kind of this catch-all category for anything that didn't neatly fit into those other three. And basically, I'm already running a little low on time here, so I'll kind of try to move things along a little faster. Basically, what we were looking at is how often were these practices being proposed in the teacher equity plans of the 47 available state plans that were out there. And are rural states doing this more often than non-rural states, et cetera? And we find that about 14 of the available plans take into account, they take a look at their rural data, and they propose something that is articulated to try to meet the needs of rural schools specifically. 11 states looked at the rural data but didn't actually propose anything that was really tailored to the rural context. There were 10 states that did the opposite. They didn't actually look at their data across rurality whatsoever, so they couldn't tell you that rural teachers are less qualified or there's higher turnover in their state and rural schools. But they still proposed rural-specific policy solutions. And 12 states really didn't take into account any of the rural context, either in their data or in their strategies. And when you see how this is spread out across U.S., states that are accounting for that rural context can be found just about anywhere. When we looked at the types of strategies being employed by different states across those four categories that I quickly outlined, we found that it's pretty evenly distributed across them. So 1 out of 5 states proposed some sort of grow your own program for rural schools in their state. Over 1 in 4 had some sort of targeted financial incentive for a rural school for teachers in high-need rural schools. Nearly 1 in 5 had some sort of rural community practice to try to retain and develop rural educators. And about 1 in 3 had some sort of other strategy aimed at building the capacity of rural schools. Interestingly, there wasn't really much of a relationship between the rurality of a state and how much they accounted for the rural context in their policy plan. So whether or not they looked at their data in their rural schools had almost nothing to do with whether or not they were a highly rural state. That's that column in the middle there, the portion that analyzed rural equity gaps. You see that if you're a highly rural state, fewer of those states actually looked at their data than states of moderate rural importance. And then if you're a more rural state, you're only slightly more likely to propose something that was really rural specific. So, what can we take from this? Basically, we know that there are definitely steps being taken to try to improve teacher staffing in rural communities. There's a recognition that there are challenges to attracting and keeping and developing teachers in rural schools. And we're really just starting to look at data to help us, drive and make the right staffing policy choices. However, there is a lot of innovation out there, and I think there's a lot to be learned as states are starting to implement some of these, really innovative strategies that are aimed at helping rural schools. And hopefully with the improvement of data systems, we'll be able to have a better chance to measure the effectiveness of the programs and see whether it moves the needle or not on improving, the level of teacher effectiveness or teacher qualities in rural schools as compared to other schools. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview of what's going on the policy side of things. We'll have a quick question and answer at the end, and feel free to email me directly if you didn't have time to ask your question. So I'll pass it off to John.